I went a little bit crazy with tomato experiments this year, and I grew my tomatoes 9 different ways to show you exactly what version is the most successful, depending on where you are. So how we're gonna do this is I'm gonna tell you the conditions I place the tomatoes in, what the results are looking like / steering me towards, and how you can make the decision as to whether or not it's going to work in your environment. Because remember, Geek Crew, everyone is from different spaces, different levels of sun, temperatures, you name it. So you need to choose what best fits your area. Now, if you do not know, the Geek Crew is going to comment down below what works best for them in their area. So if you hear someone say they're from Toronto and this is what works, you're probably going to want to listen to them before you listen to me, because they're smarter than I am. And if you want to join the Geek Crew, because most of you are not subscribed, you just kind of watch in the background, come on over. We're a friendly group of people. We don't bite. Maybe the redheads do, but the rest don't. I cannot be held liable for anyone who bites. Method number 1 is trellising. Yes, I got a beautiful arch, kind of like a cattle panel, but not cheaper than a cattle panel, off Amazon. And I decided to trellis a lot of my tomatoes. Let me tell you, this is highly beneficial in a space where you don't have much light. Now, this space that these plants are in does not have much light, and it's yielded great results. The reason why this is working out so fantastically for me in this otherwise shaded space is because it is bringing the plant up above what is naturally heavily shaded by either trees or actual physical structures such as my house and the deck, and bringing it into the light. So the bottoms of the plants don't have much in the way of fruit, but when you get closer to the top of the arch where there is more sun, you have some very happy plants. So trellising, great for anyone who has a shaded space that's under a certain footage, say the bottom 5 feet is shaded, and then the above portion is actually very well lit. You just need to get over the hump. And this is a great way to do it. So I will be doing this again next year. Okay, the next one is actually growing in full shade. So these plants behind me are in pretty much shade. I will say they get some morning light and they get some evening light, but the majority of the day they're in the shade. I would say it is definitely less than 6 hours. They all are exhibiting very similar patterns of morphology, and that is next to no flowers. Editing Ashley here. Yes, on a boat. Desperate times, desperate measures. But what I will say is that the plant itself, if you notice and watch the morphology, like between each leaf, so the internode is very stretched out compared to what you would normally see on like a regular tomato, and that's another sign of lack of sun. Besides the fact that it's missing flowers, the lack of sun can also cause very leggy, odd looking growth. The leaves are huge. It's another sign that it's not getting enough sun, and this you simply cannot turn it around. Growing in shade, unless you can get things trellised and above what is the shaded portion, it's not going to work out in your favor. Okay, next up is actually in containers. Now, I haven't done this in a hot minute, but I decided to go to containers for some of my tomatoes. Now, I did this in particular with my special tomatoes, meaning ones that I only planted one of, or I scouted out at a greenhouse that I want to save seeds from. So these special tomatoes got special treatment in what I knew would be a very successful way to grow tomatoes. Now, these ones are in a salt lick tub, which if you do not know what that is, it's literally a tub of salt that cows lick out of. These, hands down, have been one of the best, not the best in all aspects, but one of the best ways to grow tomatoes. And next year, I'm doing the exact same thing. That is how successful they are. So a couple things I am noticing with this is more foliage, which can be a benefit or not, depending on what your goals are. I have more actual fruits by far, and those fruits are fruiting faster. So I had them in a container. The container obviously causes warmer roots, and the container in and of itself constricts the plant enough to force sexual reproduction because the plant is now panicking to reproduce. So that is why things fruited and flowered so quickly. I also had these out sooner because they were in a container, they were mobile, so I was able to move them around when there was frost. And I did use something called red mulch, and I did a whole video on red mulch, so if you want to check that out. But that was kind of what projected it much quicker earlier in the season. Now that red mulch is kind of obsolete because the plant itself is covering that, but initially it seemed to give a beneficial response to the plant in its entirety. The actual plant itself is done. Now, this isn't a determinate plant, it is indeterminate, but I think the stress of the heat combined with the restriction of the roots has caused the plant to say enough is enough, and it is no longer flowering. I wouldn't plant all my tomatoes in this method, but I would plant some if you wanted to get tomato harvest much sooner than anyone else. I have been harvesting tomatoes, large size tomatoes, not just cherries, for about 3-ish weeks now, and I am in the middle of August. So middle of July is when and about I ended up actually harvesting full-blown tomatoes, and quite a few people were actually shocked by that over on Instagram when I posted it because they said they didn't have cherries yet. My climate, by the way, if you're in Saskatchewan, zone 3, it has been very cold, very cloudy, and then high heat, and it's just been a spastic summer, unfortunately. But it works wonderfully for early yields, but not for long-term high yields. Well, let's take a look at the other methods. Next up is actually the patch that I chose to plant my tomatoes to their first true leaf. So if you watch my video on potting up of the plant itself or my tomato seedlings, I did pot them up so that they are level with the soil surface, meaning the plug from the seed start is level with the pot that I'm potting it up to, the nursery pot I'm potting it up into. Now, that means the cotyledons are above the ground and the first true leaf is above the ground. This entire patch I planted so that the first true leaves are below the soil surface, which is kind of sinking them. What people are trying to do when they dig their tomatoes in deep is they're trying to mimic what they have done in warmer areas of the world, such as Florida and Texas, in a large production scale place to increase yield by escaping the heat, if you will. Now, they never sunk them to 4 or 5 leaves deep. I'm not saying that you can't, it just may not be in your best interest. These are only sunk to about 1 true leaf. Now, this actually yielded probably not the worst. There's one that definitely yields much worse, but second worst plant production I have had out of all the methods I tried. The reason I think this is happening is that my climate is cold. My soil is cold. It takes a long time for my soil to warm up. And because of that, the plant itself is stressed out. Now, the other reason for this, I actually do believe, is that there's a little bit of energy that has to go into forming those adventitious roots. Now, these roots obviously are roots in the sense that initially, when they're kind of their little stubby selves, they're used for more stabilization and less water and nutrient capture because they don't have much in the way of root hairs. Eventually, as the season goes on, they do gain those root hairs and they do serve that purpose. But you have to think about how much energy goes into that. And if I have a plant that's already stressed out by very cold soil, you can see how it doesn't end up very well. Now, I've done it for years, and I've just very recently switched to a different method of planting, which I'll show you here in a little bit, which yielded fantastically. Overall, still have some flowering taking place, and I have a decent amount of fruit formation. Nothing crazy, pretty much standard to what I normally see this time of year. And yeah, this is the way I've done it for years. So there's nothing really special to me in this patch until I start comparing it against other plants. This is very difficult to show on camera, but I did fertilize some of these in different ways. Now, the ones in containers are with just synthetic granular, and they are the exact way that I made the soil from this video here on reusing potting soil. Both of these garden beds, regardless of the different methods used in them, is no fertilizer, so control on the insides. The middles are organic and the outsides are conventional fertilizers. And you can literally look at the gardens and they look like this. Now, that doesn't mean that conventional is better. What it does mean is that conventional put on a lot more biomass. And by biomass, I just mean more greenery. That greenery, and I personally think a lot of senses, was the star of the show. It took over the flowers. It reduced the level of flowering that actually took place on a lot of these plants, which obviously is harmful to my yields. So the answer to fertilizer, I do think, when it comes to gardening, and because gardening is not necessarily intensive in a home gardening situation, a market garden is a totally different discussion, but in a garden of your home, I would say the answer is probably somewhere in between synthetic and organic, all the way to maybe only applying fertilizer every second year, because they're very likely, and in my case, very obviously, is an excessive amount of, in particular, nitrogen, which decreases my yields, but increases my foliage, which is not what you want when you're growing vegetables, and not what you want when you're even growing flowers for that matter. So definitely something to think about. Okay, hands down, the method I'm using, regardless of where the plants are planted, whether that's in ground, in containers, organically grown, not organically grown, you name it, and that is flowers. I am going to be adding a ton and or interplanting flowers heavily in all of my tomato growing situations. Now, the reason for that is because I have noticed a pretty drastic increase in yield, particularly with flowers that flower heavy, such as my cherry tomatoes. And because of that, I do believe the result was from the flowers. I never really intercropped with flowers heavily. I did it sparsely, but not to the extent I did this year. And while some of these are beginning to die off because I'm lazy and I don't really actively deadhead often, my laziness has resulted in a lot of dead flowers. But in the season, heat of the moment, things are looking pretty good, pretty sharp. So intercropping of flowers, not only does it look pretty and your garden doesn't look like a big blob of green at all times, it adds a little bit of spice. Okay, so these next ones are actually in the front yard where there's an endless volume of human beings walking and cars that like to rev their engines, particularly because it's cruise weekend this weekend. These two actually yielded some pretty interesting results. The first one being the green Vigo bed that I planted my plants into. Now, this one yielded really good results. So the reason for this, I think, comes down to actually the black buckets that I used. So these black buckets are repurposed what would otherwise be garbage from a grocery store, oddly enough. Now, all that was done with these is the bottoms were cut off, placed over top of the tomato seedlings when they were babies, and this allowed for more heat capture and what I believe actually increased the temperatures at night. Now, you've heard me say this before, wait till your nighttime temps are above 10 degrees Celsius before placing your plants outdoors. This method actually allowed me to plant these tomatoes outside much, much earlier than any of my other ones without causing any sort of stress. The other thing uniquely that I did in this scenario is I planted the plants very, very close together. And so this tight proximity gave the benefit of added heat and better retention, but it also has its downfalls. And I probably am not going to mimic again next year. And that is, it was very difficult to stake these plants because of how close together they were. So I had to get inventive and actually almost rope them all together because I just physically couldn't fit enough stakes or cages or anything into the space. So that is a downfall. The other downfall is if I had disease, or when I do experience disease, it is going to be game over for that patch because it is nearly impossible to prune that to the extent that would be needed to reduce the potential for disease spread without causing some pretty serious harm to the yield on the actual plants. So I mean, the black pots, yes, the planting density, not so much. Now, this one actually is a special mention that wasn't purposeful in the sense that I wrote it down in my garden journal as something that I intend to watch or follow to see the results from. And that actually is specifically the Vigo Modern bed. Now, what makes this bed so unique is the fact that it has a double wall. So the inside and the outside, there is air in between the two. And if you're in a climate with extreme fluctuations, such as what we experienced here this year, where I am, from really high heats to really cold colds and everything else in between, that regulation of heat, rather than having the plant completely level and exposed to air, rather than having a thin piece of plastic or a piece of wood in between the two, or metal, galvanized steel in between air and soil, the buffer of the temperature actually gave me really good results just overall inside of this bed. The tomatoes performed well, the flowers are performing well. It is hands down probably one of the most full beds, despite the fact that I planted all my beds in nearly the same density except for the green one in the front. The density, or the increased biomass, I actually think comes down to the fact that I have a very healthy root system in the Vigo Modern bed, and the healthy root system can be contributed to the fact that I'm not having wild temperature fluctuations inside of this bed. So this may be a good bed if you are in a climate where you intend to winter or early spring garden in a space where you want to perennial plant, but you can't perennial plant in the ground, and you want to try perennial planting in a raised bed, which doesn't always work out, but in this case, I think would probably work out pretty darn nicely. And this is actually the bed that I am going to be putting more of my fall garden into. So, honorable mention. Okay, before talking about the best bed or the best planting method, let's talk about the hands down absolute worst possible planting method for tomatoes. And that is full sun, a very, very hot heat, and a no dig garden. So this bed is all the same tomatoes you've seen throughout this entire video, because I started these all from seed. So they're all the same age, they're all the same varieties. They're intermixed in the sense that there's like brandy wines all over and whatever. They're mixed up, but they're all from the same family, from the same greenhouse. They've just spread their wings and flown into different spaces in the garden. They're my children, okay? I have to sometimes speak about them as though they are. The front yard is where I decided to put this. Now, the front, you've heard me complain in this video here where I talked about yellow leaves. One of the reasons for the issues I'm having with the squash in my front yard is because of the intense sun that the front experiences. So these tomatoes experienced very high levels of heat, very high levels of sun. I did not shade cloth them, mostly because I didn't want an eyesore in the front yard, because I am semi-respectful of my neighbors in the sense that I don't want it to look like garbage up there. The no-dig method is not going to turn this bed around in any capacity. The only way the no-dig method will turn around this bed is if I just plant herbaceous perennials, which is actually what this space will turn into, because it is such a nightmare to deal with due to the heat. And the heat of the roots actually not only affected the tomatoes, but it also affected the rhubarb that was next in this space as well. So hot soil, high heat, high sun exposure, just horrible yields, horrible vegetative growth, and just all around, just horrible results, unfortunately. But let's get into the best method. This patch behind me is my best patch. The tomatoes on this are massive, and they are much further ahead than any of the other tomatoes, maybe besides obviously the Salt Lake tub or the container varieties that I have tried, or the ones that I have planted in actual physical containers. I do still have some flowering on these ones, which does separate them or make them different from the container varieties, which seem to have petered out already at this time in the season. Now, the reason why I believe these tomatoes are doing so well actually comes down to the fact that the tomatoes themselves, when planted, were planted level with the earth, meaning I did not sink them to the cotyledons and I did not sink them to the first true leaves. I made sure my root ball was completely level with my soil. I think this is what benefited me because I don't stress out my plants with having to now make adventitious roots. And I also give my plants the benefit of having warmer soil in and around the root ball right away earlier in the season. I believe truly that that is the reason why these are doing and performing so well. And personally, going forward, I will be utilizing this method of growing because of how shockingly well the results did turn out. A huge factor in why these tomatoes all around performed very well, regardless of where they were in the garden or how they were planted, actually comes down to how I pruned them. So this video right here actually goes over the best pruning methods that you should utilize if you don't want to cavitate your yields. And this video down here is what Google says you should watch because I don't know, they're smarter than I am.